On June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler launched his greatest gamble. It was a war for ideology, a grab for resources, and it was the single largest land invasion in all of human history. This operation would end up sealing the fate of the Third Reich. We're going to break down the whole story of Operation Barbarossa.
Just to wrap your head around the sheer scale of this thing, look at that number. Over 4 million men, backed by thousands of tanks and planes, pouring across the Soviet border. You know, this wasn't just another battle. It was a collision of entire continents, of armies and ideas on a scale nobody had ever seen before.
So how did this colossal gamble play out? We're going to walk through the 5 critical phases of this whole campaign. We'll start with the plan itself, then we'll witness that seemingly unstoppable initial attack. We'll see how ego and the weather got in the way, dive into the absolute catastrophe at Stalingrad, and finally, we'll watch the tide turn for good at Kursk.
Okay, so first things first. For Hitler, invading the Soviet Union wasn't just a strategic choice, it was a core part of his worldview. He absolutely despised communism, and he saw the huge, sprawling lands of the East as Germany's rightful living space, or Lebensraum. The whole plan was to just shatter the Red Army in a few weeks, grab all their resources, and that would be that. This whole conflict really boils down to a classic showdown: quality versus quantity. On one side, you've got the German war machine. I mean, these guys were technologically superior, battle-hardened, and they were the absolute masters of the Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. But on the other side, the Soviet Union had two things Germany just couldn't compete with: what seemed like an infinite supply of soldiers, and a country so massive you could retreat for 1,000 miles and still have an army and a nation to defend.
And right here, before a single shot was even fired, you can see the first major crack in the plan. The German High Command split their forces into 3 gigantic army groups: North, Center, and South. Now, a lot of the senior generals were really worried about this. They thought it would spread them way too thin. But Hitler's authority was absolute. Nobody dared to question him. And that silence, well, it would have some truly monumental consequences.
With the plan set, the invasion kicked off. And honestly, for the first few weeks, it looked like Hitler's gamble was going to pay off in the most spectacular way possible. The speed and the sheer ferocity of the German attack, it was just overwhelming. I mean, the pace of the German advance was just breathtaking. In less than a week, their elite armored divisions, the Panzers, had already linked up way behind enemy lines near Minsk, trapping a huge Soviet army. Just a few weeks after that, they did the exact same thing again at Smolensk. The Blitzkrieg was working perfectly, and it really looked like the Red Army was just completely collapsing.
And the scale of the Soviet losses was just staggering. And that first big encirclement at Minsk alone, 300,000 Red Army soldiers were captured. Stalin himself was reportedly so shocked when he heard the news that he just retreated into silence for over a week.
And then it happened again. The victory at Smolensk scooped up another 310,000 prisoners. So in just over a month, the Germans had inflicted casualties on a scale that would have completely broken most other armies. The road to Moscow looked wide open.
So this is the crucial point, right? By the late summer of 1941, Germany looked absolutely invincible. Its biggest enemy was on the ropes, and their main objective, Moscow, was just a few hundred miles away. What could possibly go wrong? Well, the answer to that question came in 2 parts. First, a catastrophic strategic mistake made by Hitler himself. And second, the arrival of an enemy that no army in history has ever truly defeated: the Russian winter.
This was the moment. This right here. His top tank commanders, guys like Heinz Guderian, were literally begging him to push forward and take Moscow while they had the chance. But Hitler overruled them. He ordered the main panzer force of Army Group Center to stop, turn south, and help Army Group South encircle another huge concentration of Soviet forces down near Kiev.
Now, tactically, the move was another massive success. They captured 500,000 more Soviet soldiers at Kyiv. But strategically, it was an absolute disaster. The main drive on Moscow was halted for 2 precious months, and that lost time, that would prove to be fatal. By the time the panzers finally turned back towards Moscow in October, the weather had turned on them. The autumn rains transformed the landscape into this sea of mud that just bogged everything down. And then the cold came. The German army, which is only equipped for a summer campaign, was totally unprepared. Tank engines wouldn't start, weapons froze solid, and soldiers suffered from horrific frostbite. The advance literally ground to a halt, just miles from the Kremlin. So after barely surviving that first winter, Hitler launched a new offensive in the summer of 1942.
But this time, his focus wasn't on Moscow. It was on the oil fields in the south. And this new plan would lead them to a battle for a single city that would become one of the most brutal and decisive fights in all of history.
So while the strategic goal was supposed to be oil, Hitler developed this personal obsession with Stalingrad. Capturing the city that was literally named after his arch-nemesis, Joseph Stalin, it became a matter of pure pride. It was a massive propaganda goal that overrode all military logic. He diverted critical forces just to take it, and that stretched his armies dangerously thin.
This quote from a German officer, it just perfectly captures the horror of that fight. The battle for Stalingrad devolved into a total meat grinder. We're talking savage, house-to-house, room-to-room combat, where you measured progress not in how much ground you took, but in how many lives were lost. And the battle just unfolded in this tragic step-by-step collapse. First, you had the brutal assault into the city. Then, in November of '42, the Soviets launched this massive counterattack, Operation Uranus, that completely encircled the entire German Sixth Army. A desperate relief attempt failed, and finally, starving, frozen, and out of ammo, the German commander surrendered, directly defying Hitler's orders to fight to the last man. The human cost is it's almost impossible to comprehend. Over 100,000 soldiers of the once invincible Sixth Army were marched into captivity. Of those, only about 5,000 ever survived to see Germany again. Stalingrad wasn't just a defeat. It was an annihilation that the German army could never, ever recover from.
Now, you'd think after the catastrophe at Stalingrad, that would be it, but Hitler wasn't finished. In the summer of 1943, he gathered the last of his elite armored divisions for one final massive offensive. The plan was to try and regain the initiative by cutting off this huge Soviet bulge in the front line near the city of Kursk. And to lead this attack, Hitler was pinning all his hopes on new technology, his so-called wonder weapons. You had the formidable Tiger tank, with its incredibly powerful 88mm gun, and the brand new Panther, which was designed for one purpose, to kill the Soviet T-34. For a brief moment, it probably seemed like German engineering might just turn the tide of the war.
But here's the reality. All the fancy new tech in the world couldn't change the basic math. While Hitler was waiting for his new tanks to roll off the assembly line, the Soviets, who knew exactly where the attack was coming thanks to their intelligence, were just massively building up their forces. In every single category, men, tanks, artillery, the Germans were hopelessly outnumbered before the battle even started. And the result, with the largest tank battle in history, nearly 2,000 tanks clashing in this brutal, up-close fight. But the German offensive was just smashed to pieces against the deep Soviet defenses. The very best of the German panzer divisions were destroyed, and with them, any last hope of victory in the east. After Kursk, Germany would only ever be on the defensive.
Which really leaves us with one final thought. While the massive defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk were the final nails in the coffin, you have to wonder, was the war already lost 2 years earlier? Was that single decision to divert his armies away from Moscow back in 1941 the exact moment that Hitler's greatest gamble became an unwinnable war?